It's been 9 years since our last Captain America film, and a lot has happened in that time. While it is still in the same franchise, we have a new Captain America in himself, Sam Wilson. So following the debut of his first feature film, it's only right to rank all 8 Captain America films that have been released over time, starting with the worst and moving up to the best. But before we get into that, please let me know what your ranking would be, as there is a lot of different quality in here which could make for some very interesting rankings. So yes, without further ado, let's get into my ranking of all 8 Captain America films. In 1979, they had nothing to go off in terms of Captain America in recent years, so this attempt at a live-action adaptation was very, very poor and kind of missed the whole essence of the character. Where the titular character is supposed to be this selfless patriot fighting Nazis with ties with World War II, this Steve Rogers prefers to paint and drive motorcycles and take himself out of any scenario that involves fighting, including not even wanting to be Captain America. So from the get-go, that just makes him very hard to latch onto and to like, and besides that, he's just void of any sort of charisma or personality, so once again, it's hard to latch onto that. Good pacing is essential to any film, yet this film just doesn't have it. There's no smooth flowing narrative, it's very bumpy, up and down the entire time. Whether that be from kind of long takes where the camera just lingers on a scenario for way too long, where it's really off-putting, or the opposite where it's kind of just constantly editing really fast or editing at a very awkward point. To be honest, it makes scenes more laughable than intended. Yeah, I know it's 1979 and you can even say my videos have some jarring editing and awkward moments, but I'm not a studio. This is a studio-made film, so at least I can use that as my defense. It's easy to go back nowadays and say that this Steve Rogers has none of the personality traits of the one we have today. Even besides that, it's just hard to like this character, and alongside that, all the things going on around him just aren't interesting, aren't stimulating, and not to mention the costume looks absolutely ridiculous. Next on the list is that film's direct sequel, Captain America 2: Death Too Soon. Now these two films are supposed to be like a TV special, but they've been split into 2 parts and listed as movies here. And yeah, this one's not too much better, it's more or less the same. There are slight improvements, especially with the story and the way it flows, and there is more action, but overall it's still poorly made. You have the jarring editing, dull script and characters, and the costume still sucks as it's pretty much the same one as before. As I said, all I can really give it kudos for is having a more ambitious plot, even if it doesn't really work or doesn't become that much interesting. But I guess you got Christopher Lee as the villain, so that's an improvement in itself. But it's still a very poor film. It's definitely in that bottom tier of superhero films, but then again, it's one of the more earlier ones, so you can let it slide for that. But it's not even one where it's hilariously bad, it's just kind of dull. Looking at other rankings, Captain America 1990 is the one that people tend to have at the bottom, and while this isn't me defending it and saying it's a great film, it's still in that lower tier. I thought this one offered a little bit more than the other two, and perhaps given that it's more recently made, it was kind of put together a bit better. One thing which I do appreciate here more so than the other one is mainly in the first half or the first quarter of this film, it felt closer to the Steve Rogers we do know today. So they kind of followed his origins from the comics in that sense. Although saying that, later on in the film he does fake sick twice to steal a car of someone, so it's kind of hit and miss, but there were at least some attempts to stay truthful to this character's origins. I think this is another case of it kind of takes itself way too seriously, so even when it is a little bit campy, there's no charm to it. It's just purely campy because it doesn't know what else to be, and it's before these sort of films could be made to a high standard, so it just looks bad. I know bad is a broad sense, but it was just the sheer cheapness of it all, whether that's from the editing, reversing the footage in such an obvious manner, or even the costumes, not just Captain America's, but Red Skull's as well. The story is extremely generic, the editing and flow of the film, once again, jarring, and yeah, it doesn't really offer much past a small attempt at adapting his origins. This film tends to be excluded from rankings as it's not a film, it's a serial, and it's like 4.5 hours long. So this was a long one to sit through, but I kind of watched it in kind of like an episodic format. There's not much here which ties it to the actual Captain America character other than the costume itself, because it is such a drastically different take, and one which it's hard to compare, to be honest. This serial is so old that Marvel wasn't even called Marvel back then, so a completely different film with someone in a Captain America costume, and that's the title of the film, obviously, but it doesn't embrace the silliness of it all. Again, it's quite serious, but to be honest, that does work in some areas. It was refreshing to see how grounded this was for the most part, and for its time, the action actually isn't too bad. It's more impressive than the ones below it on this list. There wasn't a huge amount of edits in between, but it was quite a dull experience, especially for 4.5 hours. There was so much exposition. I didn't really feel much watching it, to be honest. The one emotion I felt was laughter when they revealed the name of the evil weapon being the vibrator or something. That I found quite funny. It's just a very drawn out serial, and it's definitely because of what I've been used to nowadays, but I'm sure this was a lot more entertaining back in the day, but it was just so dialogue heavy. Not too much was actually going on within these 4.5 hours, so yeah. I didn't think it was terrible. It definitely wasn't terrible. We've seen terrible on this list before, so I think right here is the perfect spot for it. Which leads us to the MCU films now. Captain America: Brave New World, the latest addition into the MCU, and the reason for making this video, it wasn't great, we'll be honest, especially when we've been spoiled with such good high quality Captain America films before this. This one was very troubled. It didn't exactly know where it wanted the story to go, and it just had a lot of messiness about it. I appreciated the grounded attempt in this film, and it definitely was a good move. However, when it did that, it then started to draw things from The Winter Soldier in such an unsubtle way where it just felt like a worse copy of it. As I said, I appreciated the grounded tone. I also liked how they started to connect to the wider MCU and tie up some knots which we thought weren't going to be addressed at all, as well as indicating to where things could go in the future. So as a franchise film, what it does for the universe, I appreciate the end result, but looking at it as a film in its entirety, it is very flawed. I was so pleased that Anthony Mackie finally got his leading role, but I feel like the script kind of wastes his potential and doesn't give him anything to really develop his character now that he's stepped into the Captain America mantle. Harrison Ford was surprisingly committed to this role and actually was probably the better performance in here, with his Red Hulk scenes being very entertaining. Definitely the best part of this film, because other than that, the action sequences were heavily edited, not as badly as the films lower down in this list, but it was very noticeable. And yeah, I wanted to enjoy this film, but it just had so many issues. It was very messy that it can't live up to the same potential as the other films. The first Avenger marks Chris Evans' first portrayal as Captain America in a journey which would eventually be iconic, and I was actually quite satisfied with this first entry. It's definitely nice looking back to see how simple the MCU once was. Because of that, some people tend to like this film a lot less because it's not as tied to the wider universe, but it's very important in establishing his morals and just who he is as a character, because his personal journey was quite interesting, seeing him go from this very weak individual to gaining all these powers yet not changing mentally, still having the same mindset, just being a good person. I fitted in well alongside that World War II environment because it was just something we hadn't seen in this franchise before, and we haven't really visited that time since. It pushes the MCU into a good direction, which obviously paid off, and had some fun action along the way. Now, I was a bit disappointed where it kind of glossed over this whole portion of World War II, and I didn't love the finale, but it got us in the right place. So besides a few nitpicks, very strong first outing for Chris Evans, and obviously the start of something great for the character. Rather than doing more of the same, Captain America: The Winter Soldier places this character in a new environment. Just seeing his reaction to everything in itself was an interesting direction, incorporating a corrupt government and turning this into a bit of a spy thriller definitely was the right decision that the Russo brothers took. And because of this more intimate setting, it allowed for them to develop Steve Rogers into a more interesting character. The story is so tightly knit, and it all comes together with great success once the credits start rolling. Now, while the story and the script and characters are great, there has to be a special props to whoever organized the action choreography, because the hand-to-hand combat was simply outstanding and some of the best we've seen in this franchise. Even nowadays, there's just something authentic about it that you don't get with any CGI or anything like that. It's just simply brilliant hand-to-hand combat, and it doesn't get old rewatching it today. So yeah, this is a very important entry for the character itself, you know, allowing him to adapt into the modern world. But besides that, it's just a really cool film with some fantastic action. This could be viewed as controversial, not to say that people don't like Civil War. Everyone likes Civil War, but a lot of people really love The Winter Soldier. While I do like it, I've never been on that fence which just has it in their top 5 MCU. I do really appreciate it, but I just don't have that emotional attachment to it for it to be that high. But Civil War really gets the emotions going because it addresses so many details which would be important to know if these heroes existed in the real life. You know, like what happens with all the destruction after a big fight, even if they are saving people. What do they do with the collateral damage, stuff like that. So the fact that the government get involved and try and sort these accords out, naturally you're going to have some disagreements on how to resolve it, and it's a very understandable reason to fight because these two both want the same thing, but they have different approaches about it, and I do understand both sides of it. Not to mention that it's pretty much Avengers 2.5 by this rate. You get so many characters that you love interacting and even fighting off against each other. But it's not just fan service, the way it's handled is superb. Whether that's the classics that you're used to, characters stepping out of the background to have a more prominent role, even the newcomers like Black Panther and Spider-Man. It's all executed extremely well, and it's tied together by Zemo, who I think is one of the better villains in the MCU. Not through sheer demeanor and how menacing he is, but the intelligence and the way he can turn these characters against each other. I thought it was just very well executed and resulted in a fantastic film. This one is definitely top 3 in the MCU for me. I can't remember exactly where I placed it, but somewhere in there. And yeah, because of that, I just easily had it in at first place for all of my Captain America films. But there is my ranking. I hope you did enjoy. I'm sure not many agree with me, and that's fine. I'd like to hear yours because it's just nice hearing different opinions as well. Feel free to include that 1944 serial as well. I don't think many people have watched it, and I did look at the runtime and kind of sigh a bit, but we made it through. We got there in the end, and I've had to do it again with Superman serial, which was around a similar duration, but I just like including as many films as I can in these sort of things. So yeah, let me know what you think of the video, what your ranking is, and yeah, hope you did enjoy, and I hope to see you in my next video.